They had spent months behind barbed wire, watching the same fences, the same towers, and the same guarded gates. Yet inside an American prison camp, something impossible began to take shape, because for the first time since their capture, the boundary in front of them no longer looked as fixed as it once had, and instead of running toward the possibility of freedom, many of these German prisoners hesitated, stood still, and made a decision that even the guards did not fully expect. When the German prisoners first arrived at the American camp, the fence did not feel like a detail of the environment, but like the clearest possible definition of their new reality, because the barbed wire, the towers, and the guarded entrance formed a structure that explained everything without needing words, showing them exactly where they were, what had ended, and what now controlled the shape of their days. In that sense, confinement was not confusing at first, because it was visible, measurable, and complete, and for men who had been trained to understand the world through clear lines of authority and restriction, that clarity carried a strange kind of stability, even when it came in the form of captivity. As the days passed, this structure became part of the rhythm of camp life, not simply because it was enforced, but because repetition made it feel permanent. As the prisoners moved through the same spaces, followed the same paths, and adjusted themselves to the same visible limits until those limits no longer demanded attention. The fence was always there, the towers remained in place, and the gates stayed within the order of things. So over time, these features stopped feeling like active obstacles and instead became fixed points in an environment that, while restrictive, had at least become understandable. They no longer needed to think constantly about the boundary, because the boundary had become part of how they organized their thoughts. The gate, in particular, existed as a silent confirmation of that order. It did not need to be dramatic to be effective, because its meaning was obvious every time it remained closed, guarded, or treated as the unquestioned edge of their world. It was not something they discussed often, nor something they studied with curiosity, because there was nothing uncertain about it. A closed gate meant exactly what it appeared to mean, and that simplicity was important because it left no room for interpretation. Their position was inside, the world beyond it was outside, and the distance between those two states was held in place by a system that seemed complete. That sense of completion began to weaken not through a major event, but through a change so small that it first appeared almost meaningless. There were moments when the gate did not seem to carry the same message it once had, not fully open and not completely abandoned, but no longer presented with the same visible insistence as before. It might appear less tightly controlled, or seem to exist without the immediate tension they had unconsciously associated with it. And this did not create instant movement or instant hope, but it created something more difficult to process: ambiguity. For the first time, the gate no longer felt like a symbol with a single clear meaning, and that shift, however subtle, began to disturb the stability they had built around it. At first, no one acted on this change, because action would have required a certainty they did not possess. There had been no announcement, no formal change in rules, and no direct signal telling them how to interpret what they were seeing. So the prisoners continued with their routine, while carrying an unspoken awareness that something in the environment no longer fit perfectly within the framework they had relied on. The gate began to draw attention in a new way, not because anyone approached it openly, but because it had become impossible to look at it without sensing that its meaning had shifted. Within the group, this new awareness remained mostly silent, yet it showed itself in small behaviors that would have been easy to miss from the outside. Some of the prisoners looked toward the gate more often than before, while others avoided looking at it altogether, as if refusing to acknowledge the change would preserve the stability they preferred. No one wanted to say too much, because saying it aloud would force the question into the open, and the question itself was unsettling. If the gate no longer meant exactly what it had always meant, then the boundary around which they had organized both their movements and their thinking was no longer as simple as it had once been. By the end of those first days, the real change was not physical but mental, because the gate had started to occupy a different place in their minds. It was still there, still visible, still part of the camp, yet it was no longer just a barrier. It had become a possibility that none of them had asked for and none of them fully understood, and that possibility did not bring relief. Instead, it introduced the first real instability they had felt since their arrival, because certainty, even painful certainty, had at least been easier to endure than a boundary that now seemed less fixed than before. In the days that followed, the quiet change surrounding the gate did not disappear or return to its earlier clarity, but remained present in the background of camp life with just enough consistency to prevent anyone from dismissing it as imagination. The prisoners continued to eat, move, and wait within the same spaces as before, yet the structure they had relied on no longer felt entirely solid, because one part of it now seemed slightly less definite than the rest. Nothing had been dramatically announced, and no one had openly explained what had changed, but the simple fact that the gate no longer appeared to communicate the same absolute restriction began to affect the way they watched the camp around them. This new awareness altered their attention in small but important ways. Some of the prisoners began to notice things they had previously ignored, such as the timing of the guards' movements, the moments when supervision seemed less immediate, or the way the gate could remain in view without drawing the kind of tension it once had. These details did not add up to a clear conclusion, yet they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore with each passing day. The camp still looked like a prison camp. The fence still stood, the towers still existed, but one element within that system no longer seemed to carry the same force, and that difference was enough to disturb the logic of the whole structure. What made the situation more difficult was that the uncertainty did not create action as quickly as it created hesitation. If the gate had clearly remained closed, there would have been no question. If it had been openly declared accessible, there would have been a different kind of shock. Instead, the prisoners were left in a space between those two conditions, where the possibility of movement existed without being defined, and this undefined space proved far more unsettling than a simple order would have been. It did not tell them what to do, but it also did not firmly tell them what not to do, leaving them in a state where inaction came less from obedience than from uncertainty. Inside the group, this uncertainty began to influence conversation in subtle ways. The shared certainty that had once shaped their reactions no longer appeared as quickly or as naturally, and statements that would once have been reinforced by immediate agreement were now sometimes followed by silence, brief glances, or restrained responses. No open argument was needed for the atmosphere to change. It was enough that the men no longer seemed equally sure of what the gate represented, and that difference, even when unspoken, created a slight distance in the way they responded to each other. One prisoner, after days of quietly observing these changes, found himself standing nearer to the gate than usual during an ordinary movement through the camp, not because he had decided to test anything, but because his attention had already shifted before he realized it. In that brief moment, he became aware that nothing happened immediately. No voice interrupted him, no rapid movement from a guard signaled correction, and no instant reaction restored the old certainty. He remained still, not moving forward, not retreating, but caught in the strange experience of discovering that proximity to the boundary no longer produced the automatic response he had expected. That moment passed without visible consequence, yet it changed the way the situation could be understood. What had once been only an uneasy idea now felt more real, because the gate was no longer merely being observed from a distance. It had entered the realm of lived possibility. The prisoner did not speak much about it afterward, but the slight difference in his manner was enough to suggest that something in his understanding of the camp had shifted. Others noticed, not because they had seen everything, but because changes in atmosphere inside a confined group are rarely invisible for long. As these small moments accumulated, the gate began to take on a new and heavier meaning. It was no longer only a symbol of confinement, yet it had not become a simple path to freedom either. It now represented a tension between what had always been assumed and what now seemed possible, and that tension grew stronger precisely because no one resolved it. The prisoners did not rush toward the gate, but neither could they return fully to the earlier simplicity in which it had meant only one thing. By the end of this stage, the true pressure no longer came from the fence itself, but from the fact that the boundary they had once accepted without question had become uncertain, and uncertainty proved far harder to live with than a closed gate ever had. As the uncertainty surrounding the gate continued without resolution, its presence began to extend beyond simple observation and into the way the prisoners experienced their own position inside the camp, because what had once been defined entirely by visible boundaries was now influenced by a possibility that could not be clearly measured. And this shift made it increasingly difficult for them to rely on the same mental structure that had previously organized both their movements and their understanding of the space around them. For some of the prisoners, this change first appeared in the form of hesitation that went deeper than physical movement, as even the idea of approaching the gate began to feel more complex than it should have been, not because they expected immediate punishment, but because they could no longer predict what would happen with the same certainty as before. And this lack of predictability created a pause in their thinking that was unfamiliar, forcing them to consider a situation that did not fit within the clear patterns they had been relying on. At the same time, the absence of a decisive moment made the situation more difficult to interpret because nothing happened that could clearly confirm or deny the possibility the gate now represented, and without a single event to define the change, the prisoners were left to navigate a gradual shift that unfolded over time, making it harder to identify when their understanding had started to evolve, and leaving them with the sense that something important was changing without ever being formally acknowledged. Within the group, this gradual shift began to influence behavior in ways that were not openly discussed, as small differences in how individuals reacted to the gate became more noticeable, with some prisoners allowing their attention to linger on it longer than before, while others deliberately avoided it, as if refusing to engage with the possibility it suggested, and this variation did not lead to direct conflict, but it introduced a quiet fragmentation in how they related to the same environment, because the gate no longer held a single, shared meaning. One prisoner, after repeatedly finding himself drawn toward the edge of the camp without fully understanding why, began to recognize that his thoughts were changing before his actions did, as he could imagine approaching the gate more clearly than before, even though he did not take a step beyond what he considered safe. And this realization did not bring him closer to action, but instead created a deeper sense of tension, because it showed him that the barrier was no longer only physical, but also psychological, existing within the way he interpreted his own limits. As this awareness deepened, a more unsettling realization began to take shape among some of the prisoners, not as a clear conclusion, but as a growing recognition that the difficulty they were experiencing was not caused by the gate itself, but by the uncertainty it introduced into their understanding of the camp, because what had once been a simple boundary was now something that required interpretation. And this requirement forced them to engage with their situation in a way they had not been prepared for, making the possibility of leaving feel less like a clear path and more like a question they did not know how to answer. By this stage, the uncertainty that had formed around the gate was no longer something the prisoners could keep at the edges of their attention, because its presence had begun to affect not only how they observed the camp, but how they understood themselves within it, as the simple idea that they might be able to leave had transformed from a distant possibility into a pressure that existed in every moment they were aware of it, making it increasingly difficult to return to the earlier state in which the boundary had required no interpretation. This pressure became most visible during a quiet moment when a small group of prisoners found themselves standing closer to the gate than usual, not as part of any plan, but as a result of movements that no longer followed the same predictable patterns. And in that moment, the absence of immediate restriction was impossible to ignore because nothing in their surroundings forced them to step back, and nothing clearly demanded that they remain where they were, leaving them suspended between action and inaction in a way that none of them had been prepared to experience. One of the prisoners took a step forward, not quickly or with determination, but slowly, as if testing not the physical space in front of him, but his own understanding of what that space represented. And when no immediate reaction followed, the significance of that step became greater than the movement itself, because it revealed that the boundary they had relied on no longer responded in the way they expected, creating a moment of stillness in which the absence of correction felt more powerful than any command they had previously obeyed. The others watched without intervening, not because they were indifferent, but because they were confronting the same realization at the same time, as each of them understood that what they were witnessing was not simply an action, but a challenge to the structure that had defined their experience since their arrival. And this shared awareness created a silence that carried more weight than any spoken reaction, because it reflected the fact that none of them could fully explain what the situation now meant. For some of the prisoners, this moment triggered a deeper and more personal conflict, because it forced them to recognize that the decision to move forward or remain still was no longer determined by external control, but by their own judgment. And this realization introduced a form of responsibility that felt unfamiliar and difficult to accept, as it required them to define their position without relying on the system that had previously done that for them, creating a sense of isolation that was not caused by distance, but by the awareness that each of them now had to face the same question individually. As the moment passed without resolution, the tension did not disappear, but instead settled into a more persistent form, because the possibility of leaving had been made real without being fully acted upon. And this partial realization made it impossible to return to the earlier certainty in which the gate had meant only one thing, leaving the prisoners in a state where the boundary was no longer simply imposed on them, but existed as something they had to interpret and respond to on their own. A shift that marked the point at which the difficulty of their situation became less about confinement and more about the weight of a choice they had never expected to face. As the moment near the gate passed without a clear resolution, its impact did not fade, but instead settled into the daily rhythm of the camp in a way that made it impossible to ignore, because what had been revealed could not be unseen, and the prisoners now carried with them the awareness that the boundary defining their world was no longer as absolute as it had once seemed, a realization that did not create immediate movement, but altered the way they experienced every moment that followed. In the days that came after, the gate remained in its ambiguous state, neither fully open nor strictly enforced in the same visible way as before, and this continued lack of clarity placed the prisoners in a position where the possibility of leaving was always present, yet never clearly defined, forcing them to exist within a tension that did not come from physical restriction, but from the knowledge that action was no longer entirely prevented, and that inaction had become a choice rather than a simple condition. Some of the prisoners began to approach the gate more frequently, not with the intention of leaving, but as a way of confronting the question it now represented, and each time they stood near it without crossing, the act of remaining became more deliberate, because it could no longer be explained as obedience alone, and this shift transformed what would have once been seen as passive behavior into something that carried meaning, even when no words were used to describe it. Others avoided the gate altogether, not because they were unaware of the change, but because they understood it too clearly, and engaging with it would have required them to face a decision they were not ready to make. So they remained within the familiar parts of the camp, continuing their routines in a way that preserved the structure they still relied on, even as that structure no longer held the same certainty as before. As time passed, a pattern began to emerge that did not need to be discussed to be understood, because despite the absence of a visible barrier that forced them to stay, most of the prisoners did not leave, and this lack of movement became more striking with each day, as the possibility remained untested by the majority, creating a quiet but powerful contrast between what could be done and what was actually done. In the end, the most significant change was not that the gate had lost its meaning, but that its meaning had expanded beyond a simple restriction, because it now represented a decision that each prisoner had to face in his own way. And for many of them, the act of staying was not the result of being held back, but of choosing not to cross a boundary that no longer existed in the same form, leaving them in a position where the question of freedom was no longer defined by the absence of barriers, but by the difficulty of acting when those barriers were no longer clearly in place. What made this experience so difficult to understand was not the presence of a barrier, but the moment it stopped being absolute, because once the boundary lost its clear meaning, the prisoners were no longer held in place by something they could see, but by a decision they had to face on their own. And in that quiet space between possibility and action, many of them discovered that staying did not always come from being forced to remain, but from the weight of choosing not to leave. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.